The next question to think about is, so we have an innovation, how does it end up spreading? How does it spread from place to place? So there's some terminology that's used to describe this. So when you've got a change that's starting to spread, the focal area, this is where that change originated. So where the innovation originated, and also the area in which that innovation has been fully adopted. So if there's a particular city where everyone has adopted some new change, right, then that city would be the focal area. And then the relic area is the area that the innovation hasn't spread to. So it's an area that hasn't been touched by the innovation. And then quite often there's going to be an area in between, right, where some people have adopted the innovation and other people haven't. And this is called the transition area. Right? So we have a focal area where the change has been fully adopted, transition area where some people have adopted it, and the relic area where it hasn't yet reached. What tends to happen is that if this is a change that keeps spreading, then the focal area spreads out farther and farther as more people adopt the innovation, and so does the transition, right, as it makes new inroads into what used to be the relic area. This can be a source of dialect differences, right? So if there are a whole bunch of changes that all share the same focal area and the same relic area, then really we have two different dialects, right? The focal area is one dialect and the relic area is another dialect. In some cases, the change keeps on going, and the focal area spreads to ultimately the entire speech community of that language. In that case, we've got a linguistic change that has gone to completion, right? So that's, for example, the example of T in Latin becoming D in Portuguese between vowels. That happened ultimately to all of Portuguese, right? But it probably started, or of course, it must have started in some area, right, before it just kept on spreading and it went to completion. So sometimes that happens, but lots of times there is still a relic area that's left. So in English, there are lots of different dialects of English, and what these reflect changes that have spread, but they haven't spread to everyone, right? They made it so far, but not any farther, and so we ended up with different dialects, different ways of pronouncing English. So if you think about what are these actual areas, not just colored circles on a map, typically focal areas tend to be large cities, right? So places that have pretty lively cultural activity, lively economic activity. In a place like this, you're going to have lots of different social networks and lots of people who are connected to more than one network, which, as I mentioned earlier, is the kind of ideal situation for getting changes to start and to spread. So cities are kind of an ideal incubator for innovations. And then relic areas, these tend to be rural areas. Okay? And in particular, geographically isolated rural areas. So for example, if there's a river that isn't often crossed, right, not many bridges or whatever, that separates a city from a rural area, well, it's even less likely for the change to spread. This is less true nowadays, right, with modern communication, but throughout history, this was a really major factor. So let's look at two examples, more concrete, of how changes have spread. One is the pronunciation of R across Europe, and the other is the northern city shift in the US. So originally, in all the languages of Western Europe, there was a phoneme R, and it was pronounced as an alveolar consonant, usually using the tip of a tongue. So something like R, that kind of like a trilled R, for example. But then starting in the 1600s, so if anyone speaks French, you'll know that French R today, standard French R, does not sound like R. It sounds very different. And this was an innovation. The uvular pronunciation of R, which sounds like R, this developed in Paris. So uvular R, rather than using the tip of your tongue to produce the R, you actually take the back of your tongue and touch it to the uvula, which is that thing that hangs down in the back of your mouth. So it's very different in terms of articulation, in terms of what you're doing with your mouth, but the acoustic effect is similar enough to an alveolar R for it to be considered a type of R. So this was an innovation, and Paris was the focal area, and not surprising, right? I just told you that focal areas tend to be big cities, and of course Paris, very big, culturally active, economically important city. So, okay, then this innovation spread from Paris, but it spread in a kind of interesting way. Okay, so okay, as you'd expect, it spread gradually out from Paris to the rest of France. But it also jumped, sort of leapfrogged to other cities in Europe. So it spread in Germany to Cologne and Berlin, to The Hague in the Netherlands, to Copenhagen in Denmark, and to Bergen in Norway. And then what effectively happened is that each of these cities where the change kind of leapfrogged to, they also became new focal areas. And so the new uvular pronunciation of R started spreading outwards from these cities to the neighboring countryside as well. In Germany and Denmark, that eventually went to completion. It became the standard for the entire speech community. But this didn't happen in the Netherlands and not in Norway. Right? So Dutch and Norwegian, not everyone uses a uvular R, whereas in German and Danish and also in French, it did spread to be just the standard for all the language. So the important point that we get out of this case study is that the spread of linguistic change isn't always purely geographical. It's not always just about spreading out from a single point, right? So it didn't just start in Paris and keep spreading further and further from Paris. It jumped to other cities, and that's a reflection of, at the time, these were the other really, really important centers, right? So people from these cities would have been traveling to Paris, right? And they would have picked up, if, depending on the circles they moved in, they would have picked up this new way of pronouncing R, and basically then they brought it home with them, right? Then it spread to other people in those cities. And then we often see this, right? So changes often spread first from city to city, and then later they spread out to the countryside surrounding the cities.